Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tate Modern. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sonia Dyer. I'm Curator of Public Programs, and I'm particularly delighted to present tonight's event, Coco Fusco, Dangerous Moves, Performance and Politics in Cuba. So tonight represents a rare opportunity for us here in London to hear one of the most exciting, relevant, and politically engaged artists working today, Coco Fusco. Coco is, as we all know, an interdisciplinary artist and writer. Her performances and videos have been presented in exhibitions including the 56th Venice Biennale, 2 Whitney Biennials, the Shanghai Biennial, and Performer 05. Her works have been shown at Tate Liverpool, the Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Centre, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, amongst other places. Coco's show, Coco Fusco and the Sea Will Talk to You, is currently on display at Cecilia Brunson Gallery in London. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including a 2014 Cintas Fellowship, and in 2013, both a Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellowship. 2013 Absolute Art Writing Award, the result of which is the focus of tonight's conversation. Exploring performance and politics in post-revolutionary Cuba, Dangerous Moves, Performance and Politics in Cuba marks a major new piece of scholarship, a survey of contemporary Cuban life and culture through some of the country's most daring artists, working across visual arts, music, poetry, and activism. Coco is joined by art consultant and curator Gabriela Salgado, Argentine-born curator based in London. Gabriela has curated a large number of exhibitions, including the second biennial of, I can never pronounce this word, Thessaloniki in Greece, and has lectured in over 20 countries. She was also previously public programs curator at Tate Modern. Gabriela works internationally as a curator and art consultant, and is currently directing a program of exchanges between African and Latin American artists. So our format for tonight is going to be primarily a conversation between Gabriela and Coco, followed by a Q&A where you have a chance to ask questions, make comments, and then at 8 p.m. we can move over to the foyer next door for a book signing. Before we begin, I must also extend our sincere thanks to our partners, Saskia Newman at Absolute, Abigail Varian at Starting PR, and Hester Seddon at Tate Publishing. And that's it from me. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Coco and Gabriela to the stage.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Can you hear me? Yeah. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Coco for coming such a long way to do this, present this wonderful book. I would like to remind you of a book that you wrote in 2001, The Bodies That Were Not Ours, where you traced performance, mainly Latin American performance, where you said that as you live historical memory as a psychic and bodily experience, that duality drives your desire to explore its repercussions intellectually through writing and physically through performance. You are a writer, a scholar, and you are also a performance artist. So from that very interesting perspective, your new book, Dangerous Moves, that you're launching today with this event, Dangerous Moves, Performance and Politics in Cuba, traces the ambiguous and ever-changing relationship between political power and performance art in Cuba. By examining the effects of state control on artists through the last 3 decades, namely the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, jumping to the present where a new form of dissidence seems to be emerging. So our conversation is going to focus on that because you've done so much as an artist, as a scholar. You have written amazing books before this one. So we're going to concentrate only on this one. And but to begin with the conversation, I'd like you to tell us when you started visiting Cuba, what kind of period what was Cuba like when you went there the first time? And I believe it was during the special period, right?
Actually, I started going before, but I was going to actually begin by just reading a little bit from the very beginning, so you could get because I have a feeling that people have not read this because it's just out now, so you could get a bit of a feeling for how I tell the story, because I really tried very hard to tell a story not write an academic book, but tell a story. Tell a story that I felt that artists really wanted to have told from Cuba, a story that hadn't been told about Cuban art, and a story that hadn't been told about Cuba, but also because I wanted to write for people who are not specialists, to help them to understand a little bit about a country that many people are very curious about now, but know very little about. So I just want to read you the very beginning of the story, and then I can go back to this. So anyway, I think, okay. So yeah, I start with a quote. This is from a very famous speech by Fidel Castro from 1961 called Words to the Intellectuals, which is considered to be his principal statement about cultural policy. That's the speech from which comes the phrase, within the revolution, everything, against the revolution, nothing. And Hamlet Labastida, one of the artists I write about in 2009, did a mural in which he took a quote from that speech, excerpted it from the speech, and the quote is this: "The existence of an authority in the cultural sector does not mean that one should worry about abuses by that authority. Who would want or who would desire for this authority not to exist? If we continue with that line of thought, we might begin to wish that there were no militia or police, that there were no state power." So he takes that excerpt and he calls his piece Intellectuals Without Words. Okay? All right. On the 4th of May of 1990, at the opening of the Sculpted Object, a group exhibition at the Center for the Development of the Fine Arts in Havana, an artist who had not been invited to participate entered the gallery and arranged several small prints depicting bones in a circle, placing them on the floor. He then took a copy of the Communist Party newspaper Granma out of his bag, ripped a small hole in the middle of it, and put it in the middle of the circle. Then he proceeded to pull his pants down and defecate in the hole that he had made in the newspaper. During the few minutes that it took for him to relieve himself, one of the exhibition's curators squatted beside him and tried to convince him to stop, warning him that there were security agents present. The artist nonetheless completed his bowel movement and left it on the floor, after which he solemnly distributed the rest of his prints to stunned audience members before he departed. His excrement remained in the space for the next 24 hours and would serve as evidence against him. According to the artist, the scene was videotaped by state agents and the documentation was circulated among cultural bureaucrats and Communist Party officials as an example of what Cuban art should not be. 6 days later, the police arrived at the artist's home with an order to arrest him for public scandal. The artist was Ángel Delgado, and he was 25 years old at the time. He served a 6-month prison sentence for his performance entitled "Hope is the Last Thing That We Are Losing." Delgado's infamous live act marked a turning point in the history of post-revolutionary Cuban art. There is a before and an after Ángel Delgado. During the island's much heralded visual arts renaissance of the 1980s, performance art had become the aesthetic strategy of choice for serving up irreverent critiques of state art pedagogy, the state's power over artists, and the perceived hypocrisies of socialist officials. Artists in comic get-ups would interrupt academic conferences and art openings with satirical gestures. They would march down thoroughfares with sandwich signs lampooning bureaucrats' corrupt behavior, and they would engage pedestrians in Havana streets in exchanges designed to awaken suppressed desires. Performance is cheap to produce and portable, and unlike painting and sculpture, it is imperceptible to authorities prior to its actualization, making it an ideal means for intervening in unexpected places. Some of the artists who engaged in performance were emboldened by the widely held belief that Soviet-style perestroika was going to reach Cuba. In 1986, Fidel Castro had announced a campaign to rectify Cuban socialism, and some artists saw this as an invitation to act as the critical conscience of their society. Havana's art scene in the 1980s was the country's most dynamic cultural front. Cuba's art institutions had recently consolidated, and the newly established Havana Biennial drew thousands of international visitors. Those visitors were impressed by both the promotional capacities of a relatively poor country and the sophisticated work produced by the first wave of artists educated by the revolution, known as the Children of Che. The favorable impression of the Cuban Revolution that Havana's art scene created led to artists attaining unprecedented privileges, including the opportunity to travel abroad, at that time an impossibility for most Cubans. Graduates of Havana's prestigious University of the Arts enjoyed an unusual degree of freedom to express themselves, to associate with foreigners, and to embrace cultural influences from countries that were seen as Cuba's enemies, attitudes and behaviors that had identified intellectuals of the 1960s and 70s as politically suspect and undesirable. However, when the decade drew to a close, Cuban artists encountered unanticipated repression. The government went on the offensive against its spirited critics as the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union unraveled, and pro-democracy opposition groups on the island multiplied. Tensions mounted among artists, power brokers in Cuba's cultural institutions, and the country's all-powerful security apparatus. Between 1988 and 1990, numerous exhibitions were censored, artworks were confiscated, and artists whose content, tactics, or personal style tested the boundaries of revolutionary decorum were subject to mysterious retractions of invitations, intimidating interrogations, and politically motivated rumor campaigns. Party officials sometimes used a divide and conquer strategy, soliciting negative appraisals from their peers of artists under suspicion. A stern warning was usually enough to get artists to alter their conduct and thus avoid losing the privileges they had accrued as shining examples of the revolution's munificence. Although the coercive tactics of state security and the presence of informants inside cultural institutions were conversation topics that were avoided in exchanges with foreigners, Cuban artists in the spotlight understood that they had three choices: demonstrate proper conduct and reap benefits, leave the country or risk enduring various forms of internal exile, expulsion from professional organizations and jobs, social marginalization, or incarceration. When Ángel Delgado went to prison, no one protested at the state's response to his performance. Some arts professionals openly expressed the opinion that he had crossed the line, while others said nothing, probably out of fear of being tainted by association with a person who had become a pariah overnight. Most of Delgado's artist peers were absorbed at that time with finding ways to leave the country, and the liberal-leaning cultural bureaucrats who had advocated for creative endeavor that pushed the envelope were losing their jobs. In the years immediately after Delgado's imprisonment, Cuban art supported by state institutions veered away from social critique toward what has come to be characterized as a recuperation of aesthetic concerns. Given the context, it is difficult to avoid reading this shift as a product of political pressure. Overt references to state authority and revolutionary iconography all but disappeared, and discussions of art turned to such topics as technique, beauty, spirituality, and subjectivity. The severe economic crisis brought on by the withdrawal of Soviet subsidy, known as the special period in times of peace, further pressured artists to lay low and create objects they could sell and thereby eke out a living in hard times. The legalization of hard currency possession in 1993 made it possible for artists to join an emergent economic elite, along with successful musicians, athletes, and budding private restaurateurs. Discursive conventions for describing the art scene of the 1980s as excessively utopian or crudely political set in. New waves of art students were discouraged from replicating the errors of the previous decade. It is somewhat ironic that this message was often conveyed by teachers who themselves had been censored just a few years before. So that's the beginning. It basically, I set up the story that you have something that happens in the 80s, and then you have a kind of backlash in the 90s, and then you have a return to that kind of sort of very much more aggressive impulse and politicized impulse in performance in the more recent years since Fidel Castro stepped down from power in 2006. And basically, I'm comparing two periods of political transition and fragility. One is the 80s, when perestroika is anticipated and the end of Soviet subsidy is about to hit, and then the present day, or the last decade, when the promise of a transition seems imminent to people in ways that it had not been before. So anyway, I just read you that beginning to give you a general idea of how the book works. In terms of when I started to go, well, I actually went to Cuba when I was 30 days old. That was as fast as my mother could get me a passport. I was an anchor baby, strategically born in the United States to give my mother papers to stay in the US, and she was deported well, she was deported before I was born, but waited until after my birth so that she could use me to get papers to come back into the United States. And then after that, travel for Cubans living outside the country was shut down until 1979. And in the 80s, I started to go. I was invited by artists to come and see what they were doing, people from my generation who I felt a great affinity with, and I began my 30-year relationship with the Cuban artists communities that started out in Havana, and then as people moved into different parts of the world, I followed them to Mexico and to Spain and into the United States. So that's the story of that. But the special period doesn't actually begin until 1990 with the collapse of the relationship with the Soviet Union. The 80s is actually considered an era of relative stability and prosperity for Cuba.
So he was very unlucky to do that performance in 1990.
Well, but he did it in 1990 because there had been a buildup of work happening throughout the decade in which artists were getting more and more exasperated with bureaucratic control, and he was just one among many who were staging actions in a revolt against that control.
And he became an example, as you said, is before and after Ángel Delgado. I met Ángel Delgado with you actually in 2000, and 10 years later he was still telling me, don't talk about this publicly because I could get into trouble. So the repercussions of his very small action were huge. In the book, you make close associations between the 80s and the first decade of this century. Can you summarize these parallels? Why you compare these two decades?
Well, I think that there's, they are periods of political instability for the regime that coincide with a kind of aesthetic explosion in which artists are trying very hard to kind of push at the limits of the politically possible. And in part, they do so because there's an anticipation that the order is on its way out, right? This was happening in the late 80s because there was some information about what was going on in Eastern Europe was in circulation. In the US, there was some connection between some dissident groups and solidarity in Poland, for example. I have photographs of Cuban dissidents from that era with solidarity t-shirts on, and there were, there was exchanges of information at that time. Also, the Cuban intellectuals were reading magazines coming from the Soviet Union that had Spanish language editions, like Novedades de Moscú and the USSR magazine and La Mujer Soviética, or the Soviet Woman, and they were getting information about Gorbachev's speeches. And so until, I think it was 1989, that Fidel actually made a speech and by edict removed all Soviet journalism from Cuban newsstands and libraries so that the Cubans would not get any more information about perestroika and glasnost. So they knew that that was happening, and so that there was actually a sense that that something similar might happen. And also at that point, Fidel had declared a rectification campaign in which there was supposed to be a kind of cleanup of the excesses of bureaucracy, and some people were kind of encouraged to come forward and talk about the problems, right? So a lot of artists took that as an invitation to use their art forms as a forum for the airing of differences and problems. In what's happened more recently is that you have Fidel stepping down from power in 2006, Raúl taking over and officially becoming the head of state in 2008. You have the anticipation of the end of the Castro era. Raúl has actually made public statements to the effect that in 2018 he will step down. He's begun to name successors like this guy Díaz-Canel. So there's this sense of that. And there are also, even though the reforms that have been implemented by Raúl Castro are exclusively economic and are baby steps in terms of what it might mean to change the system, they do give a sense to many people that something is coming, right? It's not just the US opening an embassy. This has been going on for several years, that there's a sense that there's a imminent political transition. The other factor that is absolutely critical is that, when the Soviet Union dissolved, Cuba lost 90% of its crude oil imports. And those were obviously important for managing the country and for being transport, but it was also important because a substantial portion of that, up to 50% of that, was being resold on the open market, and that was a huge capital influx to the country. When Cuba lost that, that was what caused the special period. That's when the economy tanked, right? And when Chavez in Venezuela came into power and signed a similar agreement with Cuba so that Cuba could get 100,000 barrels of crude oil per day at a price so far below market rate that they could turn a large profit on the resale of the crude oil, that's what stabilized the Cuban economy. Again, Chavez is dead, Maduro is not going to last forever, and he's not a very powerful leader. He doesn't, he doesn't signal a future, a political future. So Raul Castro knows that this, cheap oil is going to disappear any day, and that is what is forcing him to make negotiations, to make good, be friendly with the United States in the hopes of being able to multiply his sources of trade and income. So with all of that, it comes the sense that there's a change, but also a sense that there is instability from within. Right.
But also technology is hugely important. Since 2008, the blogger movement and the exposure that artists get, and not only artists but activists, people who want to show the world what's happening in Cuba, have now access to limited but some technology to do that. So that has changed also the possibilities of artists showing what they're doing to the world.
It has, in that the sectors that are not supported by the government have a channel through which to communicate with the outside world, and that was not the case before. It was either you were, in good with the Ministry of Culture, and you would have access to the official state entities and be able to show, and foreigners would be taken to see your work, or you didn't have a kind of symbolic existence of any kind, and it would be virtually impossible for people to know about you, right? And now with everything from MySpace and YouTube to websites and blogs and so on and so forth, it's much easier for artists who do not have a good relationship with the state cultural apparatus to be known outside. I mean, the primary case of that is El Sexto, Danilo Maldonado Machado, who's been in prison since December, who's a street artist, a graffiti artist, who's very closely associated with political dissidents, who would never have been known before. But, he has blogs, he has friends who are actively sending emails about his case all the time, he has all this opposition press outside the country run by Cubans in Spain and in Miami covering his case, and so now he's at Amnesty of International Prisoner of Conscience, and people who follow the Cuba story are aware of what he does and aware of the fact that he's been in prison since December.
And he's still in prison
for a performance that he never actually was able to carry out.
So on the one hand, you talk about in book about theatricalization of activism, whereby artists dissent for the camera in order to attract attention globally about repression on the island. That is on the one hand. And then how much access people have to technology in Cuba is limited, right?
Okay, well, what I'm arguing is about the theatricalization of political activism, that the people in Cuba, like the Ladies in White and the groups associated, the Estado de Sats, they have emerged in a period in which, thanks to the ubiquitous presence of cell phone cameras, they can communicate with the outside world via SMS. The pictures are sent out, and then the next thing I see them on CNN in Espanol when I'm on the treadmill in the gym. And this was 25 years ago. To find out about dissidents, somebody had to smuggle a piece of paper out of the country, and then it had to be sent to a sympathetic journalist who would maybe publish it 6 months later, right? So it was very difficult, and the focus was on manifestos, on textual dissidence. Now it's on physical confrontation with police. You take a picture, you send it out there by email, and the next day it's in the news, which has become a dynamic since 2008 that repeats itself on a regular basis in Cuba. there is limited access to the internet. Cuba has the lowest rate of connectivity in the Western Hemisphere, only 5% penetration according to official statistics. It's also true that some very few, 35 Wi-Fi posts have been set up publicly in the last few months as if the government were making good on its promise to extend technology. But it costs $2 an hour to use it, and $2 an hour is a lot for somebody whose salary is $20 a month, which is the average salary for a working Cuban person who is not making money in hard currency in tourism, right? So it's available, it's extremely limited, and it's very expensive for most Cubans. However, there are people who, spend all their time and energy on getting access to internet. So there are Cubans for whom this is a 24-hour job. It's just to find ways to communicate with the outside world. It's also true that even though there's 5% penetration officially, there is a vast and elaborate and ingenious network of hacked computer access for which there are no official statistics. There are extremely intelligent and inventive engineers in Cuba who have quit their state jobs and spend all their time rewiring old cell phones that you don't want anymore, stealing access, Wi-Fi access from hotels and state institutions. There are foreign technicians and students who sell time to Cuban friends for $1 or $2 an hour. I have artist friends who have hacked connections to Google, for which they pay $20 a month, and a bunch of us outside will send them the money to pay. So it's true that it's limited. It shouldn't be that limited. It's also true that there is an elaborate hacking network managed by Cubans that doesn't just produce what people are talking about now, el paquete, which is a flash drive condensed version of like top TV shows and programs and stuff that you pay $2 for and that Cubans buy on a regular basis because they don't have satellite dishes or cable. It's also, getting you online and getting you onto the internet.
So this is changing, obviously, the relationship between power control, state control over individuals quite radically. And going back to the book and to performance art, one of the pointers that you make to analyze performance art is their relationship, performance artists' relationship to the state. So there is, of course, hegemonic control over the arts, but also it's important to recognize that, yes, the Cuban government presented itself as a liberal benefactor in the field of culture, as you put it in the book, which is rightly recognized internationally for the excellence of art education, something that not many countries, in my case, I know in Latin America, for instance, we had much less than that, and is manifested in the quality of artist production, which is something that everybody can see around the world. In other contexts, like let's try to compare it here, such as the UK or the US, where education is limited to those who have who can afford it, who have financial access to it. There is another type of exclusion going on. So. Given this context, are Cuban artists more affected by a sense of what can or cannot be said in their art than their counterparts in other countries? Would you say that, for instance, other artists in other countries are limited by what they say in terms of compromising their place in the market? In Cuba, they are afraid of other things.
I would say that, the thing is, I would say two things about this. First of all, state power is not reducible to censorship. People outside of socialist countries tend to fetishize censorship as the only exercise of power, okay? Censorship is the extreme case scenario. It's not the only exercise of state power. And what I try to do in the book is to show how the power of the state is much, much more sophisticated and much more elaborate and much more kind of diffuse insofar as the cooperation of the arts community is engendered through a series of kind of social engineering moves. The limitation of choices and the attractive rewards for cooperation often outweigh the power of censorship. You don't need to censor if everybody censors themselves, right? So, now that aside, okay, what I'm looking at in terms of Cuban performance's relationship with state power isn't about always focused on freedom of expression. There are other political concerns that Cuban artists have. They want to be able to treat the discourses of the state, the visual and the choreographic discourses of the state as material to do social sculpture. They want to address the problems of bureaucracy. They want to argue for the autonomy of artists vis-a-vis institutions. They want to be able to self-organize. They want to be able to address our audiences directly. These are all political questions that have to do with power. It's not all about censorship, okay? That said, censorship exists. It is practiced occasionally when the state considers it necessary, and the ramifications of the censorship, in other words, the repercussions of being censored, are far more draconian than the Western version of it in a capitalist country. In other words, it's much more likely for an artist, like, okay, El Sexto tried to paint Fidel on one pig and Raúl on another pig and bring the pigs to a park in Havana and let them loose as a performance. He didn't even get to the park, okay? He was picked up by cops before he got to the park. He was, somebody would get tipped off the police, obviously, and he's been sitting in prison without being even arraigned or a trial be set up or a formal accusation against him for the last 9 months, all right? Tania Bruguera organizes a public event in the plaza without asking permission. She's not even allowed to do the thing, okay? She's prevented from doing it, and then, and her passport is taken for 6 months, and so on and so forth. She's turned into a kind of persona non grata. Juancy Gonzalez, who I talk about, was, harassed in the 80s constantly. I mean, the harassment got so bad that he would be picked up by cops and just beat up in the car and thrown out, passed out on the street. This past summer, Juan Carlos Cremata Malverti, the top theater director in Cuba, one of the top theater directors and a very respected filmmaker who's had films in Cannes and won all kinds of awards, staged a production of Ionesco's The King Must Die. It was shut down after 2 days. He made a stink in the press about being censored, and his contract with the National Theater has been revoked. And, we're talking about people constantly being put in prison for doing cultural things of a political nature. That is not the same as me not being able to get a show at Marion Goodman Gallery, or some, curator at MoMA deciding that my project is a little bit too hot to handle. It's just not the same. The stakes are much higher. The ramifications of this kind of censure is much, much heavier in the life of an artist, and you can be made to disappear from public life in ways that are very difficult to do in a place like Britain or in a place like the United States. So I think we need to recognize that. And it's not like I'm not one of these kind of right-wing Miami Cubans who thinks that Cuba is a gulag. If the Cuban government hadn't done such a good job with art education, they wouldn't have to deal with artists who were challenging them all the time. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's not as if I can't recognize that the system has, it's read Foucault, power is seductive. It's the greatest success of that system is the seductive quality of power. In other words, its attraction to people, including artists, to the way in which cooperation is orchestrated through the creation of rewards and the creation of warnings against working against the system. So, I think that, I think if you can't, we have to be able to understand how both these things work and also understand that artists who are interested in the political, and this is something that, I've been interviewed recently by the right-wing USAID-supported Cuba right-wing Miami press about this book. And they will just want to talk to me about censorship. And I'm like, you guys, get off the censorship thing. That's like step 10, and you have to get here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, to understand where censorship fits into that. Censorship is the last resort. Censorship is going to, creates problems for the Cuban government, because then they have to respond to that. It's much easier to have plainclothes agents embedded in the Ministry of Culture guiding people as to what they can and can't do than it is to have to censor a show and then answer to it.
So you talk about panopticism in the book, which is from Foucault, of course, the relationship of the individual with its own sense of self-censoring. Also, I was interested in knowing more about the independent spaces that you operated in when you were in Cuba. You did performance. You presented 2 performances in the 90s.
One in 2000 and one in 97, yeah.
And especially I'm interested in the context of the 6th Havana Biennale, whose theme was public and private memory. You presented a work called The Last Wish, a performance for Cuba. The piece derived from your interest in women's representation in Latin American necrophilia?
No, that was another piece of mine. This was about the selling of the promise to Cuban exiles that they could pay and have their remains brought back to the island after death. Because what we were dealing with at that point was a generation, the first wave of Cuban exiles were dying outside the country, and they had been always talking about next year in Cuba, next year in Cuba, next year in Cuba, and the next year wasn't going to come, right? And I was having these conversations with people in my own family who were realizing that they were not going to go back. And so I went and I staged a wake in the name of those who couldn't die in the country that they wanted to die in, right? And then, ironically, after that, many years later, the piece that is now at Cecilia Brunson Project is the story of which is a true story of the crazy adventure I had smuggling my mother's remains to Cuba in 2011, which I had to do illegally to get her to fulfill the last wish.
That's why I was bringing it up, so we could connect these 2 works. By the way, this piece is still on until
the 23rd.
The 23rd. Can we talk about these spaces where you operated? I went with you as well to Aglutinador, Sandra Ceballos space, which is an independent space that's still operating in Havana. And how do they manage to operate within this controlled cultural milieu where everything is orchestrated by the state, museums, exhibitions, etc.? How do they operate?
Sandra is a very resourceful, brave, and ingenious artist. And in the 90s, she was one of the only artists of her generation who decided to stay. There was a mass exodus in the early 90s of artists from the 80s generation. And she decided to stay. And she and her then partner, Ezequiel Suarez, had a piece censored in an exhibition. And they said, okay, you don't want to show it? We're going to show it at home. And they took it back to their tiny 2-room apartment, and they had the show in the house. And then from that came this idea of creating a space in their apartment where things that wouldn't be shown otherwise could be shown. So artists who had been kind of erased from history and forgotten, artists who weren't in favor, projects that were too hot to handle. And, she started, and it kind of just took off, and it continued. Now, other artists have tried to do this from time to time. They open their studios, or they, during the biennial, will have kind of, unofficially recognized exhibitions. But it got to be such a big deal by 2000 that the government started getting pissed that all these people who weren't in the official list were getting benefiting from the presence of all these people who had been brought into the country, even though the government wasn't trying to have that happen. But Sandra has been able to continue largely because she is resourceful, because she's very allied with younger artists. A lot of artists do their first shows with her before their careers take off, and she builds good relationships with them. She's had some support from abroad. She did get a Prince Claus grant once, and she has gotten some help from some other foundations to help her publish catalogs, for example, or she will do small commissions to young artists to do projects with her with these grants. So it's been more than 20 years, and she's continued to do this. There was, prior to her it was more the convention for writers to have unrecognized, unofficial spaces. Somebody like Reina Maria Rodriguez, who's a very famous poet, had La Azotea de Reina Maria, was very famous. Her rooftop place where she would have gatherings and poetry readings that were not, done. And even before her, in the 70s, people would have clandestine gatherings of artists who were blacklisted. Reinaldo Arenas talks about this in his autobiography. So these would be hidden behind, rooms behind walls where you didn't know that there was anything there, and that would be the gathering place for poetry readings by the poet maudit of the time.
Mm-hmm. You included in your book some, I think is in this show, you have some images of artists from the 80s, Juan C. Gonzalez. They were occupying public space. They were mainly operating outside of the gallery circuit.
Yeah.
There was, after this, in the 90s, there was a generation of artists who were training, were teaching at the ISA, the university, and they were forming collectives. So this kind of transcended beyond this period of the 80s when these artists were kind of pioneering this idea of taking over public space with their students, with their colleagues, and creating some kind of manifestation out there without any control.
Well,
often
the student
risking.
collective, the collectives of the 90s were highly controlled, versus Juansi, who got in a lot of trouble precisely because he wasn't operating with permission. So there was a big shift. I mean, there was a major crackdown on the art scene in the beginning of the 90s, which is what precipitated the exodus of hundreds of artists. Those who stayed found themselves in a very different economic landscape, in which Cubans were literally starving, not a joke. Optic neuritis outbreaks. The average Cuban lost like 30 pounds. There was no public transport to go anywhere. I mean, the country was at a standstill. People were quite desperate, and Fidel really was forced to decriminalize dollar possession in 1993. This created the possibility for artists to make money from direct sale to foreigners, which had only occurred illegally and clandestinely up until that time. Also, the Ministry of Culture experimented with the visual arts sector, allowing them to engage in commerce directly with foreigners, which most Cubans were not allowed to do at the time. So they were the first cuentapropistas, the first sort of self-employed types, were actually people in the visual arts. And so those pressures, the combination of the political and economic pressure, pushed most artists away from political work and away from performance into producing objects that they could sell directly to foreigners who were coming to the country. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the idea of giving 3 teachers the right to organize collectives was precisely to keep the kids under control and out of trouble. Nothing that was done by Enema or Grupo Deep or Grupo Dup had any overt kind of contestatory sensibility or content. It was not directed. They were not directing critiques at the political apparatus. They were not trying to attack the right of the police to move them or manipulate them in any way. I talk about it as a kind of embellishing public space versus contesting the right of the state to hegemonically control public space. And that was there was a radical change in tone in that period that doesn't really change again until much, much later in the noughts.
What I found often is that there is a challenge that is kind of veiled in the language that is used, the appropriation as ready-made of political discourse, the rhetoric of the revolution, the icons, the iconography of the revolution, all that is kind of manipulated in a very ingenious way. The use of language, which is really interesting in Cuba, how people use language to pervert sense, to change absolutely the sense of what they're saying. In a way, with an intention to circumvent control or being censored or being punished for it. So this idea of the ready-made that is obviously imported from conceptualism and learned through school is being adapted to the local context. And through all these elements, seems to be somehow circumnavigating these difficulties.
I think that was a very strong tendency in the 80s, and that it really is suppressed in the 90s. There's not a lot of language attached to work in the 90s anymore, with the exception of a couple of people like Lázaro Saavedra, who makes a lot of kind of cartoon-like work. But in performance, whereas in performance in the 80s, it was all connected to language. You know, that in the 90s, you know, who's the archetypal performance artist of the 90s was Tania Bruguera in silence. All her work in the 90s was in total silence, walking like an Inkisi figure in silence, eating dirt in silence, silence, no words anywhere, always silence, okay? She doesn't begin to talk again until she left the country. And she, you know, now she's reading The Origins of Totalitarianism from her house. This was not the work that she was doing in the 90s. The 90s work was about silence. It was about silent, shut up, and make money.
In 2009, I saw a performance of hers at the Wilfredo Lam Center, where she presented during the Biennale opening days, where she presented the podium. Again, going back to the ready-made idea, she's presenting this icon of the revolution, the podium where Fidel gave this famous speech in 1960, right? She's appropriating that, and she's not speaking, but she's letting people speak.
This is not the 90s. This is 2009.
And 9, yes.
Fidel is out of power. Raúl is in power,
Yes.
and the transition is imminent, and everybody's talking now. Okay, this is a very we got to go by the time period and understand the However, I put this back to the beginning. This is a very famous painting by Antonia Eriz from 1968 called Tribunal for a Democratic Peace. When Eriz made it, originally it was like, it's considered the first installation produced in Cuba because there were chairs put out in front of the painting so that you would sit down and become part of the tribunal. This piece was the last painting that she made in Cuba. She was censored. She was attacked as a counter-revolutionary for making this painting, and her response to being attacked was silence and to stop painting and to become an art teacher for children, teaching them to do papier-mâché puppets, which she did until 1990, and then she left the country. Okay, so, and this is the empty podium. And this is an unrecognized reference. It's sort of, for me, it's the palimpsest. It's the podium behind the podium for the Bruguera piece for 2009. But again, the thing about the 2009 podium, people have focused a lot on the open mic and inviting members of the audience to speak. When I write about it in the book, I talk about the empty podium as the political signifier, because in reality there is no podium in Cuba where everybody can speak. There's only a podium where one person can speak, and that podium was empty. And so for me, the most poignant and most resonant political symbol there is the empty podium, not the podium with some visitor coming and saying, "Viva la revolución," which is what a lot of people did, but the empty one, because it signified the disappearance of Fidel from public life and the absence of a leader to replace him, right? And you know, that to me that was the most powerful thing in the work. But it was done, you know, inside the Wilfredo Lam Center, where you have to enter with an invitation. It wasn't everybody in the world going up to the podium. It was mostly foreigners going to the podium. So, you know, there's a bit of a kind of show there of the theatricalization of access that isn't real access.
It was very tense, though.
Sure.
Very tense. You talk about conduct. This is a concept that's very interesting, that you develop quite well in the book in relation to behavior. Tania Bruguera had a workshop called Taller de Conducta, where she trained a young generation of artists working in performance from 2000 to 2005. The word conduct appears in your book quite often. Can you define what you mean by conduct in the Cuban context? What is the behavior that people need to display in order to live freely or happily?
Okay, well, there are, you know, the Department of Public Interventions, DIP, which is Ruslan Torres's group that precedes Tanya, they were also reading Foucault and talking about conduct and making works about conduct. So, you know, there's been a discussion in the art education milieu in Cuba about la conducta, which I call conduct as opposed to behavior, because conduct seems to, you understand that it's instructed and that it's not some natural behavior, but that it's a learned behavior, right? I said, if you really, but what seems to be absent in the conversations is an understanding of the role of conduct and the politicization of conduct in Cuban public life. That, you know, politicized socialization is part of schooling, right? You get a report card in Cuba that's about your academics, but you also get a political report card as early as elementary school about your political engagement and your willingness to behave in a politically correct manner. So it's like, do you go to public, do you go to the marches? Do you go to the mobilizations? Do your parents volunteer on weekends? Do you do politically incorrect things like going to church? These are part of a report card. It's not just like a conversation. It's a document that goes into your docket as a student, right? So you're taught that la conducta, right, that is part of something that you need to develop and manifest in order to survive and to get ahead. And particularly in the first 30 years of the revolution, when money was useless because there wasn't anything to buy, conduct was the principal currency of exchange for goods and benefits in the society. So if you demonstrate good conduct as an exemplary worker, you might get a refrigerator. If you demonstrate good conduct in school, you might become the representative of the pioneros or the Cuban communist youth or the college level organizations and so on and so forth, which would entitle you to, in some cases for artists, travel, right, that others couldn't have. So conduct functions as a kind of currency. And then I talk about the different kinds of political conduct that are correct. I mean, there's, the volunteerism and the willingness to kind of forget one's individual needs to be in the service of others is a kind of nice version of good political conduct. But the more insidious forms of good political conduct have to do with cooperation with the policing apparatus. That you have to be willing to tell on your friends, that you have to be willing to speak about your friends to the police, that you have to be willing to provide information to the security apparatus, to act as an informant if necessary, to collaborate by signing letters against people. And all of those things are part of good political conduct. If you don't cooperate, you suffer the repercussions of non-cooperation, which could all include being associated with the person who's being accused of doing something, okay? So there's that. And I go in what I said, an archaeology of conduct begins with the mass executions in the first 3 months of the revolution in 1959, when Batista's henchmen were all put on public trials that were televised. And there were thousands of people brought to these stadiums to see the trials, but it was on television. So it was like a lesson on TV, this trial that went on. These were extra-legal executions of people accused. And basically, people were sent to the firing squads to be killed on the basis of being identified by regular Cuban citizens, some of whom were only 10 years old. There are pictures and film footage of the trials where you see children pointing at adults, and that's what sent somebody to their death. So this becomes a kind of public demonstration of cooperation with policing, right? That you have to identify the enemy within. And this is continued throughout since then to this day. To cooperate is to identify the enemy within. And that is part of the whole process of becoming part of the political community of the country. Some artists have chosen to work on that kind of political conduct as their material, okay? There's also the category of improper conduct. Improper conduct means you behave in ways that are run counter to socialist norms of morality. That has included being religious, being gay, dressing like a hippie, liking the Beatles, listening to Mick Jagger, now that Mick Jagger is going to come to Cuba. So there are a number, being too intellectual, el intelectualizado. I have an illustration from a Cuban newspaper of this. So all of these kinds of behaviors are included in the category of improper conduct, and to have been identified as such, you could have been sent at certain times to a labor camp, you could be imprisoned, you could be ordered for re-education, which can include electric shock therapy. That happened to a filmmaker in the early 70s. So all of this is all, that terminology of improper conduct and that process of the designation of the undesirable and improper conduct is also the stuff of some work by Cuban artists. And some of them have been identified as such as well. I'm a little worried because it's already 7:33 and we're supposed to stop talking and we should have some questions.
Yeah. Can we open it for
me
questions? Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Jazz from Cuba, and I'm very happy to be here. There's many things and references that you were talking about, and I'm just my mind going back to Cuba and all of that. So there is a lot of the way you've been saying that I was feeling it. And I used to do a lot of theater in Cuba when I was very young, and I agree with you. There was a moment that before you put in the play on, or before you start rehearsing the play, you needed to send the whole full play written to the consejo, which is, how do you say consejo?
The council.
The council, so they would check the play, and they will say, yes, you could put it, or no, it depends how hard it will be for the system. But I'm pretty sure many of us will tend to have a different opinions, and you might encounter with Cuban people who might have a different opinion to you, and they might say that they've been living in Cuba and they have absorbed the whole problem in Cuba and they've been there, and they might say that you haven't in some extent. So I wonder, what would you say to someone that lives in Cuba and might not agree with you?
That we should live in a world in which we can all have our opinions and not suffer for the differences among those opinions. Not everybody has to agree with me.
Do we have more questions? Another question at the back? Yeah? Then we come back to you.
Hello, I'm also from Cuba, and I left Cuba in '93, which was at the time when this was happening, so I'm very familiar with many of the things you are speaking. And I sort of, maybe I misunderstood you, but were you suggesting now that people like René Francisco and Lázaro Saavedra were contributing to censorship in Cuba?
Oh, it's my turn to talk? Okay. So let's put it this. René was actually directly censored in 1989 in the Castillo Real de la Fuerza project. He was among a group of artists who were working on that project, and he was censored. He was the only one, I think, who decided to stay. I think everybody else ended up outside the country. In terms of, do they contribute to censorship? Are they in a position to act as censors openly? No. On the other hand, at that time, the main professors at the ISA were Flavio García-Andía, Consuelo Castañeda, Osvaldo Sanchez was teaching aesthetics. There were a number who were extremely, Lupe Álvarez was there. They were extremely hardcore with the students, kind of pushing them to push themselves. They all left. The artists who assumed the kind of positions of authority in their place were Luis Gómez, René Francisco, Lázaro Saavedra, and a couple of others, but they were the main figures. And it fell to them to, in a sense, rein in the artist community and to communicate to the students through a number of means that they had to tone down their politics. And I would argue that, I have, copies of letters that were sent to students by these professors telling them to, give it up, right, on the political stuff, that it's not going to work for them. It's also true that many of the artists who stayed told artists who had to leave that they didn't want to associate with them anymore because that would harm them in their careers. So, you know, if you're asking, did René Francisco individually censor a person? I can't answer that question. But was he part of a period in which those with authority were instructed very clearly to rein in the impulses of the younger artists? Yes, he was part of that. And last winter, when Tania Bruguera was detained 3 times in a week, the artist who spoke out against her and published a statement against her was Lázaro Saavedra. That's on the internet. Yes. Calling her an opportunist.
He was also punished
what I was
by
going to say is
speaking
that
out.
Lázaro, no one could accuse him of, because he's been punished so many times and he's for speaking out.
Just go on the internet and find the statements. It's a
I
diatribe against her.
It was an opinion that lots of artists in Cuba had at the time.
I agree. It is true, and I was there in January, and I heard them say it. But you're asking me a question. Are they involved in censorship? I'm giving you the best answer I can.
Yes, but well, the argument was when you were speaking about education.
Yes, and in the educational system at ISA, Lázaro, René, Luis Gomez, and others specifically instruct their students to stay away from political art.
Okay, I wouldn't agree with you.
Okay, well, talk to the students. I did.
Any more questions? I think we had one here. And then you.
Hello, hi, I'm Elena, and I'm not from Cuba. I'm from Russia. It's even better. The question that I had, when you were saying that you went back in the 90s, back to Cuba, to present your work on Exile, were you actually presenting it or researching it?
No, I did performances. I did 2 performances there.
Tell me, how was it met? And who was your audience?
Well, I didn't work with the state, if that's what I did it in artist spaces in people's houses. I was not allowed, I'm not allowed to exhibit in Cuba in a state entity.
That's what I was wondering, it's like if you went there in the 90s, who were you presenting? It's like, okay.
Well, I was there 2 times already this year. No, I went to there, but you know, people who go to art shows don't differentiate between going to Aglutinador and going to Galeria Habana. They just go to the show, right, if they're interested in the show. And these both occurred during biennials in which there were a number of artists doing shows in their homes, right? So there was lots of people around and lots of people came and witnessed it.
That's interesting.
We had a question here, and then you.
Hi. I work on Cuban cinema, so this is a slightly different angle. When you were speaking about conduct, I couldn't help but think of the recent Cuban film Conducta by Ernesto Daranas. And I thought that a lot of what you were saying was interesting in relation to Cuban film, but because I look at more recent things, I find that this whole construct of good and improper conduct is very much deconstructed in a lot of recent Cuban films. And I was wondering whether you had looked at film and how you saw it in relation to performance and visual art.
I do look at film. I make films, so I do. And I give you. There are some films that address these things, but I think that the ICAIC has been very slow, painfully slow, to address difficult situations in the society. There are many more independently produced productions in Cuba now than there have been, but you also have to look at the Retorno a Ítica that was done with a script by Leonardo Padura and a French director that wasn't allowed to be shown in the film festival, and the filmmakers had to stand up and make a whole big stink about it. Juan Carlos Cremata, whose film is one of the only Cuban films to win prizes in Cannes, who has not been able to produce a film with ICAIC in more than 15 years and is constantly having to produce on his own. Even though he's one of the most celebrated Cuban directors internationally, when he wanted to make a film about gay prostitution, he had to do it on his own, Chamaco, which is a very interesting film about the darker side of Cuban reality. Nobody in ICAIC would accept a script like that. So, it's not that there's no room for anything, it's just that there's a tremendous amount of protectionism, and it's even gotten to the point now where the filmmakers in Ikaik are standing up and trying to support the independence and challenge the right of Ikaik to kind of monopolize the representation of Cuban cinema as if there isn't anything else going on outside.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I study Cuban art in London. And I have two comments. Firstly, about the comment that Lázaro Saavedra made about Tania Bruguera.
It wasn't a comment, it was an essay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it was
longer than a comment.
I was in Cuba for the past 6 months, and it was quite a popular opinion among many artists because she was allowed to perform the piece that she was apparently censored for at the Wilfredo Lam. And then when she wanted to do it in the Plaza de la Revolución, it was not allowed, which some people say she was just trying to incite that sort of response, which is why Saavedra said it would have been successful whether she was allowed to do it or whether she wasn't allowed to do it, hence why it would have been egotistical of her. And then the other thing about going back to censorship, I know it's a bit of just a small square of the whole equation, but why I think the government, I was wondering why you think the government is allowing more politically motivated art now, equally as it did in the 80s when the biennial started in 84. It was allowed as it was kind of a demonstration to the world of their leniency and their ability to allow Cuban artists to express themselves freely. And now that this biennial was supposed to be the turning point again, to welcome an international crowd and international artists, why there was more of an atmosphere where politically motivated art was more accepted than it has been before.
I had to go back to the beginning of this. It was never allowed. It was never allowed. This idea that there was once upon a time there was a beneficent government and now there's a nasty one. I think we have to. There's never been a blanket policy of accepting everything. Okay, there's always been a very kind of paranoid policy of being extremely careful about what is permitted. The issue is what artists try to do in relationship to that atmosphere of paranoia and that kind of centralized state control. That's one thing that I think we need to take into account. That was never allowed. Arte Calle worked illegally. Juan C. Gonzalez worked illegally. Ángel Delgado went in when he wasn't invited. A lot of the stuff that I talk about was not sanctioned per se, okay? That's number one. Number two, of course, you're going to get the artists or disagree with what Tania did. That's what they're supposed to say, that they disagreed with what she did, okay? The thing is, I don't really care if artists agree or disagree with what she did. What we're looking at here is state power and how it works, and why the state decided to move in this way against this work and move in a different way against El Sexto, right? And then permit other things to happen. In the end, it was all a bluff because Tania got her passport back and she left, and now she's a world fellow at Yale, right? But I think we need to look at in the moment what are the negotiations between the state and the artists, number one. Number two, people outside of these contexts in which a government has kind of monopolistic control of a cultural apparatus tend to think of censorship as something that happens because a bad guy in a black hood comes and goes bang, okay? And that is not how it works. The way censorship, if you want to understand how censorship works in Cuba, you have to look at a history of 55 years of cases to understand in each context how the apparatus operates and how artists cooperate or don't cooperate with it, okay? To create a climate of artistic disapproval against Tania is part of the mechanism of censorship, okay? The people who support her are not going to come out and say that inside Cuba. In 10 years, everybody, you go back and interview them, all those artists will say that they supported her, that they went to her house every day, that they brought her food, and that they visited her in prison, okay? I mean, I've seen this kind of change of heart after the fact. We've got to be able to look at the way that the apparatus works in a much, much more sophisticated way than saying, well, the artists don't like it. Well, I have artists who don't like me. Does that mean that it's right to censor me? If I'm unpopular, it's okay to censor me, and it's only not okay to censor me if I'm popular and all the artists support me? I don't think that that's the way that we really understand how the state operates. So I wouldn't pay so much attention to what artists told you in the moment, because they were actually rounded up and instructed by Rubén del Valle, who is the director of the National Council on the Visual Arts, before the biennial to tell all foreigners like you exactly what you heard. And they were, okay? And they were shown a video in which Tanya was represented as a CIA agent, right? To terrify them, to make them talk to you in the way that they talk to you. So, and that was made public because people came forward who were at that lecture at ISA and actually revealed it to the press.
But it was just one other thing about how the state's own opinion then changes towards artists as well, because Antonia Iris, Thomas Essen, all of these people were censored initially, and now all of their works hang in the Bellas Artes. So what do you think instigates the change there?
They're dead.
You have to die to be in the museum.
Yeah, they're dead.
Once you're dead, you can be in the museum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, have you ever had any personal brush-ins with Seguridad?
Oh, and with the Alpha 66. So, yeah, that's part of the game. But what I tell people is that, I'm a performer, I work in public space. I've had to deal with state officials and police performing not just in Cuba, in the US, in Europe, getting permissions, being carted away, being harassed and all of that. So I wouldn't just kind of isolate Cuba as the only place where policemen bother me. But sure, if you go into Cuba and you're not a Cuban national, then, whether they come at you in a uniform or they send you somebody who looks like an artist who's, chatting with you and trying to figure out who it is that you're hanging out with, you're going to be dealing with the security apparatus. That's normal.
But you've always been allowed to come and go freely?
No. I've had visas denied. I've had stuff taken away from me. I've had people have tried to take my material. I've had the rumor campaigns. I've been told that artists don't like me in Cuba too. All of that. This is like 30 years of this kind of nonsense. And I get used to it.
Also, is there a sort of blurry line between kind of preferential treatment and protectionism, as you say, and censorship, whether that be indirect or direct? I.e., are there some artists who are allowed to be more political, but because somehow they're a favourite of the state, they're allowed to practice in a more overtly political way, whereas others aren't allowed to do that?
Again,
and that's more to do with power.
I don't think that it's all about this artist versus that artist. I think it's about the specifics of a moment. Okay? Cuba's in a moment right now where they're on the world stage again. This happens like every 5 years. There's something that happens, right? Whether it's the Elian crisis, when that boy was, rescued, and then the war between Miami Cubans, or the Pope's arrival. In this case, this year, it's been the rapprochement and Kerry in Cuba and the Pope arriving, and people have been, visited by state security, whether they're dissidents or artists or just people who live near the U.S. embassy, and told, if you fuck around on that day when that man is there, we're coming after you. The day of Tanya's supposed performance, all these friends of mine were visited by the police, rounded up and put in jail holding cells for the day so that they couldn't participate, right? And they hadn't even said that they were going. One friend of mine was going out to buy juice for his kids, and he was just grabbed by cops when he walked out of his house and disappeared for 48 hours so that he couldn't participate. Those are the, this is, but this is a person who can also, on another, at another time period, might be able to travel to Spain or go do something else. Cremata, who's now had his contract with the National Theater revoked, was, one of the most celebrated theater directors in the country with a contract to produce plays in the National Theater, and now he can't do anything. So, it's not about, is this person allowed? It's in this particular moment, Cremata decided to stage The King Must Die the summer that the US Embassy is opening, when there's a rapprochement with an aging octogenarian leadership that won't die. And the US, you know, why did they shut him down? Because of the moment. Mm-hmm. You know, and he made a stink, and now they took away his contract. But last year, he did, you know, however many plays. And that's the thing, that you've got the same person today might be allowed, and tomorrow might not be allowed. Yesterday was published, and then tomorrow can't be published. You know, can do this right at this moment, can make this performance here, and then can't do that. It's the moment, and who's there, and who's in power, and who likes you at that moment, and who doesn't like you at that moment, and what did you do now, and did you say something to the press, and did you, you know, talk to this journalist who they don't like, and did you show up in a film saying something, you know, all of these things have to be taken into account in each time. It's not, nobody gets a free ride forever.
I think we have time for one more question only.
But it's not even 8. We have 7 minutes. Talk fast.
I'll talk quickly. I'm just up here.
Yeah.
I was going to say there's some interesting parallels with the complexity of state control, with China and another communist country, where it's not so easily defined, and there is this co-opting of artists and publics to kind of reinforce and re-engage that which is already an ideological norm, let's say. And speaking of specific moments, when visiting the biennial this year, I saw it was quite interesting the amount of, say, international artists that are given space for semi-political works, opposed to, say, local Cuban artists. And I wonder, within those moments or those spaces, do you think there is a moment of, say, true dissidence that is allowed, say, within a state function or state-proposed space such as Wilfredo Lam, although it is somewhat projecting a sense of politicalness or theatricizing or whatnot? Is there a moment there, say, in terms of international artists going in and engaging versus local? And what is the role of international artists when engaging with local publics or collaborating with local artists within those moments?
You want to hear me at my most cynical?
Yeah.
Because I've been to the biennial since 1986. I made a film there in 1986, and so I've kind of witnessed the evolution of the thing. The Havana Biennial is basically the Havana Art Fair. The real purpose of the biennial is to bring foreigners into the country to buy Cuban art. The amount of sales that happen out of people's Cuban artists' houses during that time period is what keeps most of them alive and afloat for the next 2 years until the next biennial. Everything else is icing on the cake, and is absolutely and utterly irrelevant to the Cuban art scene or political scene. They don't care. They care about all the curators and the collectors coming in and buying their work so that they can pay their bills for 2 years until the next one. And I actually saw something very similar at the Shanghai Biennale in 2004.
Oh yeah, the Taiwanese artists that get censored.
Yeah. It is not, you know, the foreigners who go, I get 1 million emails before every Havana Biennale, oh, I'm going to Cuba, can you tell me what to do? And I'm just like, just go and have a good time, because their presence is not central to the project of that event anymore. It was once upon a time when in the 80s, when the idea was to kind of put Cuba on the map by having an exchange with artists, their peers from the rest of Latin America, and then from the rest of the third world, and so on and so forth. Now it's an art fair. It's Havana's answer to Miami Basel. That's all it is.
And it ironically makes a lot of, or certain Cuban artists, quite internationally well known. And then their transition to international markets are much easier.
But that's not ironic. That's the purpose of the thing. It's worked.
There are many more parallels with the Chinese art scene, actually. In China, I feel like I'm in Cuba sometimes.
No, it's really interesting. I never thought of it until these moments. And looking even, say, the special period versus China's great leap years, and this transition of when the Soviet Union collapses and the countries that were in the Eastern Bloc, how they're initially affected, their transition to certain policies culturally and so on. So, I mean, yeah, but thank you.
So,
one more.
One more, that's the last one.
Hello. My question, you said very, very little about other examples apart from Tanya, of performance art in the last 10 years. And I wonder whether you could have time to say anything about other artists that you think are interesting.
Absolutely. In the book, I talk about Carlos Martiel, who has been working a lot in the last 5-6 years. I talk about the more recent work that has been produced by Aglutinador, a piece from 2008 that I like very much that was called En Medio de Qué. That was a collaboration with 6 artists. I think Celia Jr. were 2 of them, Gretel Rasua, and a couple of other younger artists fresh out of ISA. And they painted a room in Aglutinador as if it were La Bodeguita del Medio, a very famous bar and restaurant. And they painted it the same color. They put tables out with bottles of rum and cigars so that you would feel like you were in that kind of environment. And then they gave people writing utensils and told them to go in and begin the graffitiing on the walls, the names of people and of events, cultural events that had been censored in Cuban art in the last 40 years. And it became this kind of collective process of making visible what had been made invisible as people drank and smoked their cigars and listened to music as if they were in La Bodeguita del Medio. And if you've been to La Bodeguita, you know that it's full of graffitied signatures all over. But by the end of the project, literally hundreds of people participated in creating this very kind of chaotic but beautiful mural history. I talk about that piece. I talk about another piece that this group did called Intemperie that was about illegal social exchanges. So it was kind of like the negative space of social relations in Cuba, going to 5 different parks and talking about the things that are exchanges. So what is represented in the documentation of the performances is not the people that do the exchanges, but the things that are illegally exchanged. I talk about, my God, what else? Pieces that Hamlet La Bastida has done, a lot by Omni Zona Franca, some of which comes from that period of the last decade, but some of which I talk about some of their earlier works from the 90s. One piece, a Garabato para la Salud de la Poesía, a scribble for the health of poetry that they did during the annual San Lázaro processions on December 17th, with the public going and making their wishes to San Lázaro, and these guys are trying to do a kind of collective prayer for the health of poetry as a kind of euphemism for the possibility of art to continue, right? I talk about a lot of pieces from more recently. And then I also compare and contrast that with the theatricalization of activism, the televisual nature, the televised and televisual nature of the hunger striking that goes on, for example, with Guillermo Fariñas carrying out a hunger strike for 135 days straight, filmed every single day for television, not locally, for abroad. The ladies in white deciding to dress in white and carry the gladiolas and have these processions that are very carefully choreographed so that they're easy to spot, easy to identify, and it gives a kind of a level of theatricality to their activism that just didn't exist before when people weren't doing these kind of confrontational, physical forms of activism in the streets. So I talk about those things together, and then some of the kind of crossover things like this piece that was done in 2010 called 1 Square Meter of Liberty, that philosophy students from the university go to a park in El Vedado, take a piece of cardboard, put it on the ground and say, this is 1 square meter of freedom. Anybody who steps on it is free to speak their mind and talk about whatever problem they want to talk about, and then see if they'll get people to participate in the performance. And it went on for several hours with people actually participating, which was a kind of breakthrough, because a lot of times people get afraid when you think that it's a trap that's being set up by the police or that somebody's going to see them and get them in trouble. But this actually worked, and there was, it went on for an entire afternoon. So I do talk a lot about it. It's just we don't have a lot of time. Right.
The artist in the cover of the book, Carlos Martiel, is an artist working today. So yes, they are contemporary artists in the book. So I think we have to close now. Thank you very much.